Johnson will be speaking at our Southern UFO conference in April. He's a very good speaker, but he's not just into UFOs, he's very much into conspiracies, and he has done some excellent work, factual, excellent, evidential work with regards to 9/11. And perhaps, I think, at this point, I'm going to bring out Marcus. Marcus is going to be our first speaker. Now, in the run-up, I'm going to introduce Marcus. Marcus Allen is somebody who has been looking at the moon landings for about 20 years. And as time goes on, new revelations are made, and a lot of people do what a lot of people would think was very boring work of sitting through archives of original NASA photos from the original Apollo missions looking for anomalies and things like that. But in reality, they do a fantastic service to the rest of humankind, because they find things through sheer persistence, through sheer devotion to their beliefs, that ask genuine questions. And Marcus Allen, I've known for probably 10 or 11 years now, and I've seen his presentation. He has got some very fascinating questions, legitimate questions. As a former police detective, they're legitimate questions that deserve legitimate answers. And we don't get those answers. So without further ado, I would like to bring out Marcus. Now, what he's also said is, because he's that kind of guy, he wants to make reference to the fact that today's date is, in fact, significant. It is 9/11, 15th anniversary, and I think he wants to say something about that. So without further ado, put your hands together for the first speaker of the day, Marcus Allen.
Thank you very much. I hope I will receive a similar reception when you've heard what I have to say. And I'm glad there are big barriers between you and me, because sometimes people get a little exercised about what we're going to talk about. But before we talk about the moon, there is, as Gary says, something I'd like to say. Today is September the 11th. 15 years ago today, an event occurred which changed the world. We refer to it as 9/11. It was the day on which 2,974 people died. Each person who died on that day was a husband, a wife, a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a son, a daughter. Each death was a personal tragedy for their family. Each family still lives with the memory of what might have been. A few other people then made decisions which would have far-reaching effects and result in the deaths of millions more people, each one also a personal tragedy. And many of us who watched those terrible events of 9/11 also made a decision. We did not believe the explanations we were offered. We still don't. Because when doubts exist, surely we must depend on those who claim to have the answers, that they will be honest and truthful. This has not happened. So now we have had to find the answers for ourselves. This is when the internet grew up. And as people came together online searching, a community was created. It was sometimes fractious, it was sometimes divided, and it spread around the world. Some spoke out, some have posted articles, and many were astonished by what was being uncovered. The ongoing search for truth and justice has become a living memorial to those whose lives were so savagely cut short on that September morning. In the words of the activist group Anonymous, we are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you. Friends, seekers after the truth, and fellow skeptics. Because surely we're all skeptics now. We are skeptical when we are told that all vaccines are safe and effective. We are skeptical when we are told UFOs do not exist. And we're skeptical when we are told man has landed on the moon. Well, I am. And for the next hour or so, I will endeavour to show you why I am persuaded that the Apollo moon landings were just a brilliantly successful propaganda exercise. And that line, the brilliantly successful propaganda exercise, is actually taken from the film Interstellar. Anybody who's seen the film will remember the scene where the school teacher discusses our hero's daughter's insistence that the moon landings were questionable. And that was their answer. Because the moon landings, in my view, were part of a strategy by the United States to win the Cold War over the Soviet Union. Okay, let's go back a bit. Carl Sagan, a noted astronomer, TV presenter and author of a very influential book called Cosmos, popularized a phrase: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. To have landed a man on the moon is most definitely an extraordinary claim. So where is the evidence? At first sight, it appears there is plenty of it. There are the astronauts who recorded hundreds of hours of film and took thousands of photographs. There are countless books, manuals, and reports, some of which, believe it or not, are still being published today. The 400,000 people who worked on the Apollo program, the 600 million people who watched it live on television, allegedly. I was one of them. And then, of course, there are the moon rocks. Now, surely that's more than enough evidence to prove that man has landed on the moon. No, it's not. Because there are major problems with all that evidence. The astronauts were all military men. They were all bound by their oaths of secrecy, their esprit de corps, their support of each other. They, when given an order by their commander-in-chief, the president, would only have had one question. When ordered to jump, they would have asked, "How high, sir?" They will not break ranks. The film and the photographs, some of which we'll be examining today, are extremely dubious as to their truthfulness and as to what they depict. Everything we think we know about what happened on the Apollo moon landings originates from NASA. And NASA is the only source of information about what happened between liftoff and landing. There is no independently verifiable evidence of what actually occurred once those huge rockets had thundered off their launch pads and disappeared from view. Literally 2 minutes after they lifted off, they were gone. They were only 50 miles up, they were still in the atmosphere, they were going quite fast. But I hear you say, what about the Russians? Surely they would have blown the whistle. And those moon rocks, they've been examined by scientists around the world, and they all agree they came from the moon. And then there are the reflectors, placed on the moon so that lasers could be fired at them to measure the exact distance between the Earth and the moon. We'll come to those later, because none of this is really compelling, let alone extraordinary evidence. And we're going to be looking at the anomalies, the inconsistencies, and the unexplained details in the Apollo record. Because there are some really tough questions which NASA have so far avoided answering, to do with the rockets, the radiation, and the re-entry. But my primary interest is in the photographs. So now we're going to look at some from Apollo. We're going to look at a bit of the history of it, just to put it into context. And a great deal of analysis has been done over the last 20 years. This has made the in-depth research so much easier. So I would offer a word of thanks to Sir Tim Berners-Lee for providing us with the technology to build the internet. Let's just have a look at some of the photographs. I have my magic zapper here, which means that things change without me appearing to do anything. Okay, here we go. Was it fact? Was it fiction? The anomalies, inconsistencies, and unexplained details. And thank you, Gary, for organising the conference. You stand in a great line of truth seekers in Yorkshire. I mean, specifically Graham Birdsall, who was a wonderful person, a great individual, and a sad loss to a big community. This is where it all started. National Geographic, the world's top-selling magazine, 11 million copies they were selling in those days, and they put the man on the moon on their cover, December 1969. Surely National Geographic would know a hoax photograph if they saw one. Well, no, they don't. They've been caught several times by similar photographs which purported to be something that they weren't. We go back a little bit further. This is really the starting point. Life magazine, of course, another major American publication at the time. Yuri Gagarin, first man into orbit, we're told. Not the first man, not the second, not the third, probably about the 8th or 9th. But he was a personable and presentable and pliable officer of the Soviet Union. He did get a bit out of control, and if you look at later photographs of him, you'll see that there is a severe scar over his left eye where he injured himself jumping out a first-floor window when he was caught attacking a nurse. So he was a flawed hero, but he wasn't the first one in space, and there is doubt as to whether he actually did what was claimed. But it served its purpose. The Soviet Union was seen to be the preeminent spacefaring nation. So 6 weeks later, after Gagarin's flight on alleged April the 12th, President John Kennedy announced to the joint houses of Congress that it will land a man on the moon before the decade is out, etc. You'll notice behind Kennedy here in the bottom right, to his right is Lyndon Johnson, then Vice President, and would become himself President just over 2 years later. The other man in that photograph is L. Warren, who was to conduct the inquiry into Kennedy's assassination. So they're all there. Kennedy really didn't have much of an interest in space, but he had a lot of interest in politics, and he wanted to demonstrate to the American people, given that Kennedy had only just been elected president, literally a few months before he'd been sworn in January 1961. This was a major test of his leadership and the New Deal that he was going to be putting towards the American people. The fact that he was assassinated literally 2 years later, 2.5 years later, indicates that he was pretty successful. But the context of Apollo is important. The space race, the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis was going to be following in October '62. Then in November '63, JFK would be assassinated. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War would be building up. The student riots in universities across America protesting against the Vietnam War. And then, astonishingly, more assassinations of major political figures, Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. What was going on? The place was falling apart. There had to be a distraction, and the space program provided this great distraction. We have Mercury, the initial program. 1 man in space. Gemini, 2 men in space. Apollo, 3 men in space. Skylab, more than 3 men. Shuttle, up to 7. The ISS, still there today. You can see it flying over. It's quite real. All those are quite real. The Orion program, we'll cover that a little bit later. And how many here are familiar with the X-37B, which is, thank you, just a few. Keep your eye on that one. It looks like a small version of the space shuttle. It's unmanned. It's launched on the top of a Atlas Centaur rocket. And it goes on a mission. The last one was 9 months. The previous one was over a year. Where does it go? What does it do? Nobody knows. Who said NASA can't keep secrets? Who says that things can happen in space without anybody knowing about them? The X-37B is a very good example of that. All right, let's go to the moon. That list we just looked at, there's one exception to that, which is Apollo. Everything else, X-37B is unmanned, so it doesn't count. Apollo went to the moon. That is the key difference between everything else. Everything else in space, it is for real, it exists. The space station is there. We're told Apollo went to the moon. It's not very far away, you can go out now and see it. But there's a lot of things in the way, so you need a big spacecraft if you're going to go there. The top one is the Apollo craft with the Stage 3 rockets. Quite a lot. That top assembly of the Apollo craft weighs just short of 50 tons. And you see on the left the large rocket you need to launch it. Now, if you're going to have a large rocket, you've got to have a rocket which can carry a great deal of fuel, reach a certain speed, and achieve what it's claimed to achieve. If you take a Ferrari and a Ford Fiesta, they're both similar. They've got 4 wheels and a windscreen. The Ford Fiesta or the Ford Focus has a small engine, and we've got to 0 to 60 in about 10 seconds, 12 seconds. A Ferrari 458, still got its 4 wheels and its windscreen, and it's got an engine which will get it from 0 to 60 in about 4 seconds. They weigh about the same. It's the power that is available to propel it. The Saturn V rocket we see has a huge engine, but it doesn't actually go very fast. By the time it's disappeared from sight, it's doing about 5,000 miles an hour. It's got to get into orbit where it's got to achieve 18,000 miles an hour. And in order to get to the moon, it's got to accelerate to 24,000 miles an hour. The question is whether it was carrying enough fuel to do that. The calculation is quite simple. It's to do with energy and weight. And the question is, was the rocket powerful enough to launch the 50 tons we're told it took into lunar orbit? And the answer is, we don't know, because NASA won't release the figures. Let's have a look at an anomaly. This is coming back to Gemini 6. They just landed. There's a question mark. What on earth is this? Well, it looks part of the craft. It's a fiberglass aerial. What's it doing there? There's 2 divers who swam out to the craft, were not carrying it with them. There isn't enough room where it's mounted for it to be stowed in the craft, and it's just come back through the atmosphere, we're told, generating temperatures way above anything that would be required to melt that aerial off the craft. So what's that aerial doing? NASA won't tell us. If you're going to go to the moon, you want to take some photographs, and this is the camera that was taken, the Hasselblad, a very good camera, correct choice of camera. The bottom right-hand illustration is how the astronauts use their camera. That's Alan Shepard. On the left is Neil Armstrong with his camera, and in the middle is the camera that you can literally go into a shop today and buy. Hasselblad got the design right the first time. They adapted it for space travel by removing the viewfinder. Removing the viewfinder? Of course, we all take photographs without looking at our screens or viewfinders, don't we? It's so easy. They have an electric motor drive, that's the only automatic feature. The focusing the shutter speed and the aperture ring have to be operated manually, wearing a spacesuit, wearing armoured gauntlets, with no viewfinder. We'll see the brilliant photographs these astronauts took. This is a camera which I borrowed. I was filmed for a TV programme a few years back, and they managed to persuade Hasselblad to lend them the lunar replica camera. And it's just to show that it was nothing very spectacular. Bottom left image, the square underneath the lens, is the shutter button. Obviously made quite large because you couldn't see it from inside a spacesuit, so you had to feel around for it in your armoured gauntlets. The bottom right picture gives the only indication that a photograph has been taken. That's the film counter. But you can't see that from inside the spacesuit. It was battery operated. I would claim they're D2 type batteries, that size of battery, made by Varta. Apparently they were specially made for the Hasselblad camera, which seems a bit of an overkill. Why don't they just use ordinary batteries? But how often do batteries work in space? Not very often. The only exposure meter was a little chart on the left-hand side, the bottom of the camera. If you were standing with your back to the sun, you set it at a certain aperture. If you're standing with the sun to the side, another one. And the two illustrations on the right illustrate what it would look like in the top picture, with a camera taking the picture held at eye level, and a lower picture, camera held at chest level. This is what we're told where the camera was positioned on the chest. And it exaggerated, but behind is a fence indicating a horizon line. The lower you stand to take a photograph, the lower the horizon will appear to be. It's a matter of optics. It happens on Earth, it happens on the Moon, it'll happen on Mars and anywhere. It's a matter of how light travels and where you view it from. If you're going to go to the Moon, obviously it's a good thing to practice and have simulations, and these were the models that were built at Langley. Who else has a building in Langley? This is in Virginia. The CIA have their headquarters there as well, but this is the Langley Research Center. They built a model of the Moon and covered it with very accurate illustrations taken from orbiting spacecraft. That's the Ranger, Surveyor and Lunar Orbiter craft. So that, in the bottom left picture, a film camera could be mounted on tracks and filming the approach to the Moon, logical thing to do, and that would then be projected outside the lunar landing simulator. Nothing strange about that. It's exactly what you'd expect to happen. And if you've ever landed at Heathrow Airport, you hope that your pilot has practiced landing at Heathrow a few times in the simulator. This is exactly the same situation. It's a simulator. And there was also a simulator of the lunar lander that was built at Langley Research Center. It's still there today, and anybody who goes to the US, if you want to go and look at it, it's quite easy to see. It was designed to remove 5/6 of the weight of the lander so they could simulate the landing on the lunar surface. Funny they never actually showed it being used. Anyway, let's go off to the Moon. Here we go in our big Saturn V rocket, thundering off the launch pad. 1 million people watched the launch of Apollo 11. It was totally real, nothing fake about the Saturn V rocket. Clears the launch tower, and between that moment and the point that it splashes down, that's where we rely on NASA to tell us what's going on. Never a straight answer. National Academy of Space Actors. Not always scientifically accurate. Could be possible explanations for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. I don't know, I've asked them a few questions and I haven't got a reply yet. I asked them about spacesuits. Obviously they protected against the radiation in space, so couldn't they be used to go into Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island? The manufacturers said, no, there's no radiation protection in them. We built them according to the design NASA supplied. The company that made them is called the International Latex Corporation, who make very good bras, I'm told. So they're making close-fitting bodysuits. They still make them today. If you're going into space, you've got a bit of a challenge. You've got temperature. Temperature of space, absolute zero, i.e. very cold. What's the pressure in space? There's no pressure, it's a vacuum. Is there radiation in space? Yes, lots of it. Galactic cosmic rays, that comes from outside the solar system, solar flares, where the sun decides to emit a little excess radiation, which is powerful enough to literally take out the power grids in countries that it hits. It happened in 1989 in North America. We just need a major solar flare and we're all in serious trouble. We're protected though on planet Earth by the Van Allen radiation belts. Bottom left, they're basically the Earth's magnetic field protects us. That's what they're formed. The Earth has a magnetic field. The solar flares, top left, the little black spots will be the indication of a solar flare. But we travel through space quite comfortably, we don't have a problem. But if you go to the moon, you've got a problem because you haven't got any protection on the moon. There's no magnetic field like we have on Earth. And this is one of those great iconic images which allegedly started the environment movement, where you could see the pale blue dot of Earth in space surrounded by nothing, really. Well, there's a lot of stars out there, but they don't appear in the photographs because the film, don't forget, all the photographs we're looking at were taken on photographic film. They're not digital images. It's a key difference. The film isn't sensitive enough to record the foreground surface of the moon, which is quite bright, about the same brightness as tarmac, and the stars, which are much less bright. So they won't appear on the film. If you're going to land on the moon, you're going to land in a little spacecraft, and this is the inside of the lunar lander, the point that Neil Armstrong would have stood as he landed it manually. He overrode the computer. And here are our heroes, Neil and Buzz. That's why he's called Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story, named after our hero. And they're operating the lunar lander. This is a simulation. Oh, this is the simulator, because they didn't take photographs like that in space. Now here's a question. If you're going to land the lunar lander on the lunar surface, there's a famous segment of film which recounts the landing of Apollo 11, where the words you hear are basically figures. It's the speed in feet per second down, moving to the left a little, kicking up some dust. The voice you hear is Buzz Aldrin. He's relaying the information to Neil Armstrong. The question is, you can hear what they're saying. How can you hear what they're saying? Because they're in a spacesuit, obviously. Because they're just behind them is the lander engine, the rocket engine, 10,000 pound thrust rocket engine, which makes a bit of a noise. But you can hear every word they say, and you don't hear a rocket engine, so they must be wearing their spacesuit. Okay, fair enough. Look at the control panel that Neil Armstrong is going to have to operate. They're relatively small dials and levers and handles, and he's wearing his spacesuit. Would you trust your life to operate a computer keyboard with heavy-duty gardening gloves on if your life depended on it? Which his did. So I don't know the answer, whether wearing a spacesuit or not. Now we're going to come out. Neil has already done his one small step onto the lunar surface. This is Buzz Aldrin coming out of the lunar lander. And there's a sequence of photographs here we're going to look at. Here's a little bit further out of the lunar lander. And Neil Armstrong obviously got very bored watching Buzz wriggling around, getting out of the lander, so he took a picture of the rubbish bag underneath the lander. And then he also took another picture which showed the footpad. He was supposed to inspect the craft to make sure there was no damage, but quite what he'd have been able to do if there had been any damage to it, because there was no rescue service on the moon, I don't know. And then, oh well, obviously, Buzz is getting a little bit further down the ladder, so you get another picture, and here he is coming down again. They're lovely pictures, aren't they? They show you exactly what you expect to see. Man on the moon. They're so good, you don't really need a caption. And that is always the hallmark of a great picture. You know exactly what's going on. He finally gets down onto the lunar surface. Ah, dear, dear. It's a great story, isn't it? Now, in the time I've been speaking, about 3 minutes, on that sequence of photographs, there are 8 of them, is the time we're told it took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to complete that sequence. He had a camera that had no viewfinder. He had to operate the focus ring with his spacesuit on. And all the pictures are wonderfully clear, crisp, sharp, well composed, accurately exposed, and they're not out of focus. What's going on here? Is this, we're expected to believe that those were the conditions under these pictures were taken. Every single photograph taken on Apollo is available online now. I happen to use the Lunar and Planetary Institute website. This is what they look like, and you click on each picture and you get an enlarged version. If you want a high definition version, you can get that. You'll notice each photograph has a number. Top left, AS405859, and so on, consecutively. Does anybody here know what the AS stands for? I don't either. I assume it stands for something like Apollo spacecraft, or Apollo Saturn, or possibly even Apollo simulation. I don't know. There's no definition of it. And then we have footprints on the moon, one of those other iconic photographs taken on the moon. Hang on a minute. He's wearing the camera on his chest, so he's got to take it off his chest and point it at his foot. This is Neil Armstrong, or Buzz Aldrin. We don't actually know which one. They passed one camera between the two of them. They had a camera each, but they only chose to use one. And the story is, that with the design of the spacecraft, Neil Armstrong was going to be first out, because the door through which you saw Buzz Aldrin crawling out opened to the left. Buzz Aldrin was lunar module pilot. Technically, he should have been first out. And the story goes, the apocryphal story goes, which says that Buzz said, if you're first out on the moon, Neil, I ain't taking a picture. And he didn't. There is only one very obscure photograph of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. It's strange, that. Back to this one. How do you take this photograph? You point the camera at the ground and you take one picture. That's not the way photographs work. Any photographer will tell you the cheapest thing you've got is film, in this case, and you can take as many pictures as you like, lots and lots of pictures, to make sure you get the right one. You bracket it. Slightly higher exposure, slightly lower exposure. Don't forget, photographic film is very sensitive to exposure. So you bracket it. You go half a stop up, half a stop down. You take lots and lots of pictures, because film is very cheap. They only took one. Again, it's an anomaly. We've got to have the American flag, fair enough, it's Americans who got that. We're going to salute it. When they put the flag in the ground, they didn't touch it after it was erected. They saluted it, obviously, and they spoke to the President Nixon at the time. But after the flag had been placed in position, quite early on during the mission, it was not moved. But there are some weird things about this. What's this footprint? You think on first sight, no, it's just one of the astronauts walking in the other direction. Well, if he was working in the other direction, where are the footprints going, in front or behind it? This is one footprint from a rather large one-legged astronaut. It's another unexplained detail. Now we have the two of them, Armstrong and Aldrin, on the lunar surface together. That's okay. They were being filmed by the data acquisition camera, which is a cine camera mounted in the lunar lander, taking 1 frame per second. There is a time, which we'll see a bit later on, where you have 2 astronauts on the lunar surface at the same time. It's not okay. Why are they're both men of about the same height. How come the shadow lengths for each one is different? I don't know, but it shouldn't be that way. This is an unexplained detail. One of those angles is 25 degrees and the other is 35 degrees, but we're told that Apollo 11, when it landed, the sun angle was at about 13 degrees, indicating they should have had much longer shadows. Again, an anomaly. And here's an even weirder one. We have the flag, top left, as we saw in the previous image of the US flag, which wasn't touched at all, but in the film of the Apollo 11 landing, the flag appears 90 degrees different. How is that possible? We then have a camera position which appears to be quite high above the astronaut, but the camera was held at chest level. The horizon should be much lower relative to the astronaut, but it's not. And then, of course, we have the classic, the iconic image, man on the moon. Weird. Andy covered this in a little bit of detail yesterday, so just to reiterate that, there is a great deal of fill-in light on his chest, the front, where the surface of the moon is not sufficiently bright to provide that amount of light that is recorded on Kodak Ektachrome film. It has an exposure range of possibly 2 aperture stops at the most. It can be adjusted in processing, but then you would adjust, if you're going to overexpose it, you would overexpose the whole film. Why is the background just behind the astronaut quite bright, and yet the horizon and the foreground are relatively dark? It doesn't make sense if it's illuminated by the sun, which should provide even illumination no matter how far away the horizon is. The photograph on the left is the official version. The photograph on the right is the propaganda version, where it's tidied up with additional balancing light at the top, balancing black at the top, and then you have to have your explanation at the bottom. The photograph on the right was the only photograph I could find when I started this, looking at these illustrations well over 20 years ago. I had to go to an astronomy show to buy a series of photographs, and this was one of them. The internet didn't provide the information it does now. This is allegedly the only photograph of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. It was taken during a panning sequence, and you'll notice the flag is relatively low compared to the horizon. Don't forget, this is a very flat area that they landed in. There may be a few little craters, but basically it's flat. But the flag is suddenly much lower, which indicates the camera position was much higher. Again, an anomaly. As is this. What are these 2 little things here? They look like women's evening handbags almost. I don't know what they are, where they came from. I can't find any reference to them, but they're on the lunar surface. And again, Andy made a very good, strong point about where's the dust that was kicked up? Didn't that go into any of the lunar pads? Obviously not. Perhaps they tidied it up. Perhaps those things held the dusters to clean it before they illustrated it. Because there's not a speck of dust anywhere on that. It's very, very mysterious. Oh look, we've even got a picture of planet Earth. Isn't this wonderful? They're on a sightseeing trip. Yes, that's supposed to be planet Earth. Now anybody can tell you that planet Earth is considerably larger than the moon in diameter. It's 3.67 times larger than the moon. In round figures, the moon is 2,000 miles in diameter, 2,160. The Earth is just short of 8,000, 7,940 miles in diameter. and one as a percentage of the other, the moon is a lot smaller. It's 27%, 27.2% the size of the Earth. So why is the Earth so small in these pictures? It's about what you'd expect the moon to look like. So these are two consecutive photographs. How on earth did they take them? Standing on the equator of the moon, the Earth is about 2/3. It's quite high in the sky, which is why when you look from the Earth to the moon, you always look at the face of the moon, the equator of the moon. The moon doesn't change much. So if 66 degrees, the camera with a slight wide-angle lens will have an angle of view of about 45 degrees. You've got to lean back at about 50 degrees. Have you ever tried doing that? And we're being asked to believe that that is how the astronauts were able to move on the moon. They couldn't do it. So they took the camera off their chest and pointed it up at the sky. How did they know they'd even get the picture in the sky? I haven't got a viewfinder. Have you ever tried taking a photograph with no viewfinder and be sure to get it right? This is the point. This is a fictional photograph. And this appears. This is the film canister. You notice it comes from a film. Film canister. Look at the date at the top line. 11th of July, 1969. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, landed on July 20. What is this film being shot and dated 5 days before Apollo 11 officially took off? In the middle it says magazine serial number 1081J. There's another film here. Same date, different magazine serial number. They must have shot it again, it's from the film. What is going on? Is this the real film that was shot and that AS number stands for Apollo simulation because it really was a simulation? Look at the two together, they are different. The same handwriting. There was a person called Guyans, that's the photographer, G-U-Y-N-E-S, who worked for NASA in the 1960s, worked for NASA for many years. We can't get a confirmation that that particular person is the same photographer, but it makes sense, it's an unusual name. Anyway, here are our heroes. There is a top picture. Now, I use these particular illustrations because they're copied from a book purchased at the Kennedy Space Center, Story About NASA. And the top picture is astronaut Edwin Aldrin inside the lunar module after his moonwalk. That's wrong. It is not after his moonwalk. If you find the original of that photograph, it was taken 2 days before they allegedly landed. He's putting his sunglasses into his pocket, he's wearing his Masonic ring. How do you wear a ring in a spacesuit? It would probably damage it. And the photograph below is Neil Armstrong inside the lunar module as it rested on the moon's surface. That is also a lie because the photograph was taken with a flash gun attached to the camera. There is a highlight of light in his eyes, which is a telltale sign of a flash gun being used, and there is also a highlight of light on his teeth. Again, another giveaway, an artifact of a flash gun being used on a camera. It's a publicity shot. So let's move on to Apollo 12. Here is Al Bean coming down from the lunar lander. At one point to bear in mind, we hear a lot about how brave they were landing their lunar lander on the lunar surface, and how Neil Armstrong had practiced hundreds of times in what was referred to as the flying bedstead, because that's what it looked like, a specially designed craft to indicate the type of manoeuvrability required to land on the lunar surface, which only had 1/6 gravity compared to the Earth. Buzz Aldrin never practiced. He couldn't land the craft because he'd never practiced, he'd never been trained to. Supposing Neil Armstrong had an attack of, I don't know, fell about, banged his head, couldn't land it. Buzz Aldrin would have been there. You know, it's like flying on a plane. The captain can fly the plane. The first officer, who should be able to fly the plane as well, can't, because it's one of the flight crew. And again, it doesn't make sense. This is Al Bean coming down. Conrad, who was the pilot, could fly, Al Bean couldn't. If you examine this particular photograph, this is what you find. A great deal of, shall we say, rather crude retouching to make the black sky blacker. There's no need to do that if it's a real photograph. We have another sequence of 8 photographs. Took a little bit longer than the 8 minutes. Again, here we have the Apollo Simulation Series 12. And there's 2 pictures on here of Al B. Quite famous photographs because they appear in a great deal of the books about Apollo. There's a close-up of it with some weird stuff going on the left-hand side. That hexagonal shape, that is the shape of a Hasselblad lens. The shutter is mounted inside the lens on the Hasselblad camera. The lenses are made by Zeiss of Germany, originally East Germany, but they still managed to supply NASA. I don't know what that bright light on the left is, and certainly not those 2 bright lights above him. Very, very strange. This is the reflection in the visor, and you'll notice the horizon is beautifully through the middle of the visor here, and quite different position here. It's, again, anomalies. The second photograph, look where the horizon is suddenly. Same photographer, same position, suddenly the horizon is quite different. And we have, I don't know, is it E.T. visiting and flying around behind saying, what on earth is going on here? What are those 6 lights in the visor? Is it internal reflections on the visor? No, they only had 3 surfaces. I don't know what they are. Any more than these ones. This is back to the original one, which is to show, because on all the Hasselblad images, there were little crosshairs on it. And suddenly we get 2 crosshairs in the wrong position. They shouldn't be that close and that angle apart. Again, an anomaly, unexplained. Oh, here we have the shadow angles. If the moon is illuminated by the sun, as Earth is illuminated by the sun, you would expect shadows to move more or less parallel. They might diverge slightly from if it's directly behind you, but the photographer in this particular image, this is on Apollo 12, has the sun behind him. So why is the Lunar Surveyor, this small unmanned craft which landed a couple of years earlier, why is the shadow angle on that completely different? And here we have an even worse one, Apollo 17. We have the astronaut with the sun behind him and the rock on the top right, with literally the sun at right angles, the shadow at right angles. That does not make sense. It's not the way light works. Right, moving on to Apollo 14, you'll notice I haven't mentioned Apollo 13 because that really needs its own program, its own examination. We'll cover it very briefly at the end. Apollo 14, this is the lander, and notice the detail on the shadow side, because on the moon light behaves very differently than it does on Earth. On the moon, no matter how dark the shadow, it's fully illuminated because you get reflected light off a black surface. That's ridiculous. Right, this is the Apollo 14 lander. Let's just flip it around that way and look at this picture here, which shows two astronauts on the lunar surface at the same time. Who took the picture? Because it is a photograph. In the center, you'll see the crosshair indicating it's a Hasselblad image. It's a composite image of 5 separate other items. The spacecraft on the left, the flag on the right, the 2 astronauts, and top right is the golf ball, because this is Alan Shepard hitting his golf shot on the moon. It's taken from his book called Moonshot. God, they're ironic, these guys. And you could see the golf ball. Now, if you've ever watched golf on television, you'll know that you can see a golf ball in flight, but only if it's head on. You can't see it as it's moving across. It's going too fast. And is a golf ball really that size? This is a fake image, a totally fake image, which happened to be on display at the Kennedy Space Center, about the size it is on that screen, for many years, until we posted the report that it was a composite image on the website, and it was taken down the following month. It's never been seen again. It's fake. That is the TV image of the same scene. And you'll notice the flag is in a different position. So that was not a TV image. That was what an explanation offered by many people who try to support NASA through thick and thin. They're quite often referred to as PANs, pro-Apollo nutters. That's all they do. Apollo 15, this is the landing site. Hadley Rill, this is what it looked like from the ground, and there's a mountain behind, that's Mount Hadley Delta, which is, we're told, 13,000 feet above the landing site. The same height above base camp as Mount Everest is, and the same distance away. It's about 5 or 6 miles horizontally from base camp to Everest. It takes a lot longer to climb it though. And that's more or less what you'd expect to see, but on the moon, no. That is smooth compared to the foreground. This is where we start getting discussion about, well, did they put different backgrounds in? Here we have Apollo 15. The foreground is very detailed, the background is completely blurred out. There's no atmosphere on the moon. They're using the best camera and lenses you can find. How come the background is just basically a blank canvas with a sharply defined line between the two? Right, this is Scott on the left, Scott photographed by Irwin, and Irwin photographed by Scott. And the anomaly here is that these are consecutive photographs on the same roll of film. I double-checked that on NASA website. AS-15, magazine number 88, photograph number 11863 and 864. But there's only one camera. And on the left-hand image, Irwin must have taken the photograph with another camera. So where is it? Did he pass it to Scott? Why would he need to? Scott already had a camera on him. Why didn't he take the photograph on his camera? It's an anomaly. It's an unexplained detail. If you ever wanted to know where the lunar rover, which was designed and made by Boeing, by the way, it's you hope that they make aircraft that don't fold up, because this was folded up, bottom right. Very well done. It's a beautiful piece of engineering, because it could fit into a relatively small space. But was it on the right-hand side or the left-hand side? So I'm pretty sure it was on the right-hand side, but it's a mystery. Right, moving on to Apollo 17, this is taken right in the center of the photograph is the Apollo command module, the little white speck, as it just separated from the lunar lander. And they're going to land pretty well in the center of that valley. The Taurus Littrow Valley, it's called. It's about 17 degrees north of the equator. There's an anomaly here. Any astronomers here, please give me the answer on this. On the right is the photograph taken of the landing of Apollo 11, where you see the terminator. The terminator is the dividing line between light and dark. This is on a circular body. There will be a terminator. There is on Earth, we call it dusk. On the moon, you get the terminator, and the closer you get to the terminator, the longer the shadows will be. You'll notice in the crater, the shadows are quite long because they're quite close to the terminator. Right? They're about to fly into darkness. But you don't want to fly into darkness, you want to land, because if you fly into darkness, you can't see where you're going. On the left is the Apollo 17, it's the image we just saw earlier. Where is the terminator? The shadow angle in the bottom is similar to the Apollo 11 shadow angle. What's going on? Where's the terminator? It's not there. The horizon on the moon would be 250 miles away. Work that out with a bit of trigonometry. So there should be a terminator, and there isn't. It's as if they photographed that model of the moon we saw earlier and forgot about the terminator. Anyway, we're now going to take a photograph of the American flag, the astronaut, and the Earth to show where we are, i.e. not on Earth. How did they line it up without a viewfinder? It's quite a low shot. It's very difficult to line 3 objects into a photograph without a viewfinder. You can do it with a viewfinder, you know, that's not a problem. But to do it without a viewfinder, very difficult. And you'll notice a picture on the right, it's the same image, with enhanced contrast, a little bit of manipulation here, to illustrate that the moon is a strange place, because the image on the right of the flag and the Earth are in colour. The image of the astronaut on the left is black and white. Why is that important? Because it indicates it's a composite image. The two images taken together should both be in colour, but they're not. This is one of the advantages of using Photoshop. Other people have done the same examination and found that the astronaut is in black and white. The flag is in colour, and the moon, the Earth, or what's supposed to be Earth, is far too small. Okay, this is on the ground in Apollo 17, and it's just to make the point about the background, the sky. When you manipulate the image, these are all digital images, they've been scanned in, but they would have the same information. This, in my view, is what certain people claim to see when they say there are ruined places, ruined cities on the moon. They're seeing an artifact of the front screen projection images. That's only my opinion. And for the record, I don't believe that Stanley Kubrick had very much to do with it. He would have made a far better job of the film if he was in charge. If any filmmaker was assisting NASA, it is far more likely to have been Walt Disney, who was not only very friendly with Wernher von Braun, the head of the American space program, he was also politically compatible. They were both right-wing. Wernher von Braun was an SS officer. He was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people in forced labour camps. Walt Disney had no problem with that as a political concept. The two were quite close. And Walt Disney's stock in trade was the manufacture of fantasy. This is what I claim the Apollo program is, a fantasy. Right, in this illustration, in this photograph here, we see the astronaut, we see a large rock. It's called, unsurprisingly, split rock, because it also is split. And in the picture is the lunar lander. Can you see it? No, because it's quite a long way away. It's about 3 or 4 miles from the viewpoint. There it is. Still can't see it. It's very hard to actually see it until you enlarge it considerably. And there it is. It's quite a long way away. So what's going on here? The center image is the one we saw originally. There is the lunar lander, shown on the right in enlargement, and two other photographs showing the lunar lander on the Apollo 17 landing site. Look at the little light-coloured surface marked A, which appear in all three of the images. If it was so far away that the lunar lander is really quite small, would it be able to show that light-coloured image A with the lunar lander a lot closer, but the light-coloured image not any larger? Again, it's a manipulated image, seriously manipulated. And here we have the bouncing lander. Same background. Lander is supposedly back on the top photograph on the right-hand side. Hardly see it, so far away, and then suddenly it's much closer and you can see it. But nothing else has changed in the photograph. Again, another unexplained detail. Are these two photos mutually exclusive? Top photograph shows the lunar lander, the LEM, Lunar Excursion Module, with the mountain in the distance. Should the bottom photo also show the lunar lander in the same relative location? If the bottom photograph is taken from a greater distance, shouldn't the lunar module also appear in it? And it doesn't. Why is that? Because the model makers didn't get all the continuity right. This is a model set. A lot of these are models. It's a very good model, this one, and it just got plonked on the lunar surface. You'll notice that the very detailed foreground and very undetailed background, but there's no tracks showing in front or behind the lunar rover. Why not? The tower has a herringbone pattern on it. We can see astronaut footprints on the lunar surface, but no track anywhere near the wheel. Again, unexplained detail. On Apollo 17, here we have an illustration of what the lunar tracks, lunar rover track looks like on the lunar surface. We know it makes tracks on the lunar surface. So why, a couple of photographs earlier, is the track completely different design? It's like, again, continuity got a bit messed up. The two images are completely different. There are several people I'm in contact with who know what I do in terms of looking into Apollo, and people all over the world, in New Zealand, Australia, in Canada, America, in Thailand, in France, in Italy, even in Russia. People send me stuff, and this is a very helpful guy based in Canada who sends very useful information. He spends a lot of time looking into the Apollo record. So it's just building up over a long period of time. I say Russia, I actually appeared on Russian television talking about the Apollo space program, not in Russian obviously, because they had to dub me, I don't speak Russian. But Russians are interested. And I should say just in passing that I consider Vladimir Putin to be a most impressive politician, who's not only honest, but he's not our friend. As he said himself, I'm not your friend, I'm the president of the Russian Federation. The 146 million people in Russia are my main concern. Check him out, he's got some interesting things to say. Right, Apollo 17 is going to take off from the lunar surface. We've seen that. The explosive bolts fire, the top half of the lander takes off, and we see no rocket. We see, because it's actually a model, a very well crafted model, but a model nevertheless, which is difficult to put hypergolic fuel in. As the space shuttle, as Andy mentioned yesterday, the space shuttle uses the same fuel. Hypergolic means when you bring them in contact with each other, they will explode. They don't need an ignition source. Now a rocket, we're told, assuming this is for real, a rocket has an exhaust and it builds up an exhaust. So on the ascent module, which is only a 5,000 pound thrust rocket, just short of a ton, where did the exhaust fumes go? The descent stage, which was the launch pad, had a solid surface. The logical conclusion is that if the rocket fired, it would set fire to everything it touched. Rocket's quite powerful. This is not a sensible way to launch humans off the surface of the moon where they'd never been before. There's no rescue service available. So let's just come back to Earth. This is the most common photograph, and allegedly this is the only photograph of Earth taken from space. Everything else is a composite. You can recognize it by the little triangle of light, a triangle of cloud above the Sudan, to the left of the Red Sea, below Egypt. It's a great image because you recognize it immediately. It's because we've seen it so often. So if you're going to come back into Earth, you come back using a heat shield, and you come back at the same speed you left at, 25,000 miles an hour. You have a heat shield which absorbs the huge frictional pressures that are generated as a spacecraft enters the Earth's atmosphere, which is only 60 miles above the Earth's surface. It comes in at a very, very acute angle, about 6 degrees, so it'll fly for about 1,000 miles as it slows down. But it's still got to slow down from 25,000 miles an hour to basically 20 when the parachutes can open. So wouldn't the Russians have complained if all what I've said is anywhere even halfway true? No, the Russians wouldn't. They knew exactly what was going on. They also had their own anomalies. They had the question mark over Yuri Gagarin, and the Americans knew about that. Sergei Korolev, the guy on the top left, was the real genius of space travel. He had died in early 1966 of an operation. It was quite a routine operation, but he died. So the whole Russian space program was riven by competing factions trying to reach the top. So there was nobody really could make the case to President Brezhnev that maybe the Americans were not telling the truth. Surprise, surprise. So we have the rocks. Well, we know the rocks are real because they've been 342 kilos on. I've got one as well. Anybody wants to see a piece of moon rock? I've got it upstairs. It's a pretty ordinary looking piece of rock. How do we know it's from the moon? Oh, it's very different from lunar rocks, from Earth rocks. Well, no, it's not actually. And anybody who's examined a piece of moon rock, they're sent out in a box marked moon rock, so you know what you're examining. If you go to the Science Museum, you can see a piece of moon rock. You know it's a piece of moon rock because it says on it, moon rock. So you know what you're looking at. The Science Museum wouldn't lie. The reflectors. Oh dear, oh dear. These reflectors, they're usually quoted as the most definitive answer to shut these hoax believers like me up. Well, no, until you realize that Massachusetts Institute of Technology were firing lasers at the moon and getting a signal back in 1962, and the British and American military were firing radio signals at the moon and getting a signal back in the late 1940s. You think, well, why bother with a piece of kit? This is actually a French reflector. You don't need a reflector to get a signal back from the moon. You just need a very large collecting dish on Earth. So that is a definitive evidence of lunar landing. Here's the fake moon rock found in the Rijksmuseum, on display there for 30 years, examined when the Rijksmuseum underwent its renovation, found to be a piece of petrified wood. It's ridiculous, and they think they can fool us again. But they've taken photographs of the lunar landers, so I can shut up and go away and go to something else. The only way they can show, this is 2009, they first photographed these, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. The only way they can show there is something on the moon that might possibly be put there by man is by putting a whacking grey arrow on it to show where it is. It's ludicrously simplistic. you'd think they'd have better cameras. Orbiting the moon, you're traveling 60 miles up with no atmosphere. Wouldn't you think that modern equipment could get a better illustration than that? When you look at Google Maps, as taken from an orbiting satellite 250 miles up through the Earth's atmosphere, and you can see your front door, or you can see the sunroof in your car parked outside your house. And this is the best they can do on the moon. I'm not persuaded. This was taken 50 years ago with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter of Copernicus crater. So it looks like an unmarked open-cast coal mine, because there is something even weirder on the lunar surface. This was taken in the Vitello crater, bottom left-hand corner of the moon. Something has moved across the lunar surface. There's a top one, quite a small one, with a track on the bottom. It's a bigger object, it's about 40 foot across, leaving a distinct track. I spent many years trying to find another photograph showing this, and I found it about a month ago. This was taken with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter about a year earlier. It shows a similar object, or the same object, with a similar track. It's still there. These are the two with the bottom picture reversed so that it shows it in slightly different perspective, but in traveling in the same direction. It's a mystery. I don't know what it is, but there is certainly something there that has moved across the lunar surface. It's been there for over 50 years, and these are the only two photographs publicly available of it. It's as if they're trying to hide something. Right, coming back into Earth, this is what the capsule would look like when it's landed. Basically quite unharmed. This is the Apollo 14 craft. The Orion craft, which is currently being built, suddenly it has a heat shield, this is the same as the space shuttle heat shield, all over it. And the heat shield failed when they launched it for the first time in December 2014. Top left, Apollo 10 command module, that's in the Science Museum in London, you can go and look at it. And that is the command module of the Orion program. And the key on that is that right at the bottom, there's two little words which says compression pad. Compression pad are the holes in the heat shield through which the capsule is attached to its service module. So when they separate, as they would for re-entry, the compression pads, if they don't fill accurately and completely, the command module of Orion would suffer the same fate as the Columbia space shuttle, where the heat shield was damaged. It's a very, very weird situation. The heat shield on the Orion is now being redesigned. So what did we learn from Apollo? Orbiting unmanned craft is simple. Landing astronauts on the moon and returning safely to the Earth, virtually impossible. Why haven't we been back in 47 years after Apollo 11? Technology does not go backwards. It's as if we never did it in the first place. And the purpose of Apollo was to occupy the high ground, low Earth orbit. That's where the weaponization of space is taking place, which is what Apollo was all about in the first place. And I'm with Walt Disney on this one. Astronaut 4 is obviously an employee of the Disney studios. You can tell I don't think much of it. I'd just like to acknowledge that the work of David Percy and Mary Bennett. If you want to see a lot of the detail about the whole Apollo program, from Russian scientists and filmmakers, from French, from Australian, from American investigators, go to the website ourlist.com. Be prepared for a long read. Bill Casing, the godfather, the grandfather of the Apollo hoax, who died a few years ago, he started it all off in 1976. Ralph Renee, Gerhard Wisniewski, very interesting book. And Jarrah White, you know where he's coming from, and his website's called Moonfaker. So I thank you for your attention. Check out Nexus. We tend to publish articles on this. I'm upstairs. If anybody has any answers to the questions of the anomalies we've indicated, I'll be upstairs with the NEXUS stand, so come and tell me how wrong I am, please. Thank you very much.
Marcus Allen. Marcus Allen, thanks very much. Another round of applause, Marcus Allen. Right, just before you shoot off into your 20 minutes.